Alright, let's talk about tariffs. You know, those taxes on imported goods that sound incredibly boring until you realize they're the reason your new shoes cost more than a fancy dinner. Well, yesterday the Supreme Court decided to wade into this thrilling topic. In a landmark 6-3 ruling, the court essentially told the president that his power to slap tariffs on everything from Chinese electronics to French cheese isn't unlimited. The case centered on the use of emergency powers, specifically the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. The Trump administration had used this law as a sort of economic sledgehammer, imposing sweeping tariffs on nearly all our trading partners since 2025, arguing it was a necessary tool for foreign policy. The majority of the justices, however, looked at the Constitution and said, "Hold on a minute." Chief Justice John Roberts, joined by an interesting mix of conservative and liberal justices, pointed out a rather fundamental detail: the power to tax and regulate commerce belongs to Congress. It's right there in the founding documents, a key check on executive power. The court's decision affirmed that unless Congress explicitly hands over that power, the president can't just declare a global economic emergency and start inventing taxes. This ruling effectively invalidated a massive chunk of the tariffs that have been making everything from cars to clothes more expensive for American families over the past year. Of course, not everyone on the court was on board. The three dissenting justices argued that in the messy world of international relations, the president needs a wide berth to act decisively. They basically said that foreign policy is a tough game, and taking away one of the president's biggest bargaining chips, the threat of tariffs, could weaken the country's position on the world stage. But the majority held firm, emphasizing that convenience in foreign negotiations doesn't override the clear separation of powers laid out in the Constitution. The president can't just be a one-man tariff machine, no matter how much he wants to be. This decision sent shockwaves through Washington. It wasn't just a legal slap on the wrist, it was a fundamental reassertion of congressional authority. For years, presidents of both parties have been stretching their executive powers, but this ruling drew a clear line in the sand when it comes to trade. It reminded everyone that the power of the purse, including the power to tax imports, is meant to be in the hands of the 535 members of Congress, not just one person in the Oval Office. And that brings us to the politicians who have been shouting about this very issue for quite some time. Enter Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, who reacted to the news with the political equivalent of a calm, knowing nod. For her, this ruling wasn't some shocking twist, it was the logical conclusion of a constitutional argument she and others have been making for years. She pointed out that it was a coalition including conservative justices like Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett who reaffirmed Congress's role, proving this wasn't a partisan issue, but a constitutional one. Klobuchar criticized what she called the administration's sledgehammer approach, arguing that while tariffs can be a useful, targeted tool, using them as a blunt instrument against everyone, including our allies, creates nothing but economic chaos. From her perspective, in a state like Minnesota, the damage was never theoretical. She spoke about soybean farmers who, almost overnight, lost access to massive export markets they had spent decades building. When you start a trade war with a country like China, they don't just sit there and take it. They retaliate by buying their soybeans from Brazil instead. Klobuchar also highlighted the struggles of small manufacturers in her state, who suddenly face skyrocketing costs for essential parts and materials. These businesses were caught in the crossfire, forced to either absorb the costs and shrink their margins or pass them on to consumers, making their own products less competitive. Klobuchar's argument has consistently been that there are smarter ways to handle trade. Instead of alienating allies like Canada with broad, sweeping tariffs, she advocates for strengthening relationships through established trade agreements like the USMCA. Her point is that you don't treat your friendly next-door neighbor the same way you treat a global competitor who is actively breaking trade rules. A strategic trade policy, in her view, involves working with allies to apply pressure where it's needed, not starting a bar fight with everyone in the room and hoping for the best. It's the difference between performing surgery with a scalpel versus, well, a sledgehammer. This stance places her in direct opposition to the administration's philosophy that aggressive, across-the-board tariffs are the best way to protect American industries and workers. Supporters of the tariffs argue that they are a necessary evil to force other countries to negotiate fairer deals and to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States. They might point to a few specific industries like steel that saw a temporary boost. But Klobuchar and other critics argue that the widespread collateral damage, from farmers losing their livelihoods to families paying more for everyday goods, far outweighs any isolated benefits, turning a supposed economic strategy into a self-inflicted wound. So, what did this sledgehammer approach actually cost you? Well, the numbers are in, and they are not pretty. According to the Yale Budget Lab, these tariffs cost the average American family an extra $1,700 in 2025. Think of that as an invisible tax on your life. The Tax Foundation's estimate was slightly lower but still painful, clocking in at about $1,000 per household. This wasn't just some abstract economic figure. It was felt in the price of nearly everything. New cars saw prices jump by 5%, electronics by 7.5%, and clothing and shoes shot up by a staggering 18 and 19% respectively. It's the reason that wedding dress in a shop in Orange County suddenly went from $950 to $1,200. While the administration argued these tariffs were paid by other countries, economists will tell you that's just not how it works. The cost is paid by the importers, American businesses, who then pass it right along to you, the consumer. Some industries, particularly domestic steel and copper producers, did benefit from the protection against foreign competition. Proponents of the tariffs argued this was the whole point, to shield vital American industries and encourage companies to buy American-made materials. They saw higher prices for consumers as a short-term pain necessary for the long-term gain of a stronger domestic manufacturing base and more leverage in global negotiations. However, for the vast majority of businesses and families, the tariffs were a nightmare. For every protected steel mill, there were countless other businesses struggling with higher costs. Think about a factory that makes bicycles. Suddenly, the cost of the steel for the frames, the rubber for the tires, and the plastic for the seats all went up. They were faced with a terrible choice: eat the cost and risk going out of business, or raise their prices and risk losing customers to competitors. This is the economic chaos Senator Klobuchar was talking about. It created a ripple effect of uncertainty and expense that spread throughout the entire economy. The financial burden fell hardest on working families, who spend a larger portion of their income on essential goods like clothing, food, and household items. When the price of everything ticks up, it's those with the tightest budgets who feel it the most. This is the central argument against broad-based tariffs. They function as a regressive tax, hitting low- and middle-income households disproportionately. Critics argue that while protecting certain jobs is a noble goal, doing so by making life more expensive for millions of other Americans is a deeply flawed strategy that ultimately hurts the very people it claims to help. With the Supreme Court invalidating these tariffs, the next logical question is, what about all the money the government already collected? We're talking about a massive sum, somewhere between $100 billion and $130 billion. Senator Klobuchar has already expressed hope that the businesses who paid these illegal tariffs will get their money back. Major retailers like Costco and companies like Learning Resources have already filed lawsuits to reclaim the funds. The idea is that if these importers get refunds, they can lower their prices, and the savings will eventually trickle down to consumers. It sounds nice, but don't hold your breath for a check in the mail. The process for issuing these refunds will be decided by lower courts and is expected to be incredibly long and complicated. The money would go directly to the importers who paid the duties, not to the end consumers. While some of that money might translate into lower prices down the line, there's no guarantee. Meanwhile, the administration isn't just sitting back. President Trump immediately called the ruling a disgrace and, in a bold move, announced a new 10% across-the-board tariff using a different law, the Trade Act of 1974. This new tariff, set to take effect on February 24th, is less severe and has some exemptions, but it shows the administration is determined to keep tariffs as a central part of its policy. This entire episode blows open a much bigger, more fundamental debate. Who should be in charge of America's trade policy? Should it be the president, who can act quickly and decisively in response to global events? Or should it be Congress, the body designed to represent the diverse economic interests of the entire country, even if its process is slower and more deliberative? Supporters of presidential power argue that in a fast-moving global economy, you need an executive who can negotiate from a position of strength without getting bogged down in congressional debates. They believe the president needs every tool available, including tariffs, to protect national interests. Ultimately, this question matters immensely because trade policy is tax policy, and tax policy affects every single American. It determines the price of the food you buy, the car you drive, and the clothes you wear. It can create jobs in one sector while destroying them in another. The Supreme Court's ruling was a major victory for congressional authority and for those who believe that such impactful decisions should be made through a slow, representative process. But the president's immediate response shows that this struggle over power is far from over. The real question for Americans is who they trust more to make decisions that directly impact their wallets: one person in the White House or 535 people in Congress.